Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. My name is Crystal, and I am your host today for our session, Healing the Core Relational Wounds. And our session today is with Dr. Diane Poole Heller and Dr. Scott Lyons. Diane is having some connectivity issues today, so I just want everyone to keep that in mind. And as we gather today from various corners of the globe, we would like to acknowledge that the land that we live and work on is the traditional territory of many Indigenous peoples. We respectfully honor their people, cultures, and traditions. And today I am joining you from the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. I invite you to take a sacred pause to acknowledge and honor the land on which you reside. And with that, I'd love to introduce our instructors. Dr. Diane Poole Heller is an internationally recognized speaker, author, and expert in the field of attachment theory and trauma resolution. Her signature approach, DARE, Dynamic Attachment Repatterning Experience, provides therapists and individuals with relevant skills and practical exercises that facilitate healing from attachment and trauma wounds. Diane's training programs, books, lectures, and work as a therapist have helped a countless number of people in their healing journey towards experiencing greater intimacy, wholeness, and more fulfilling relationships. Scott is the founder of the Embody Lab, a hub for embodied education, self-discovery, and healing, and developer of Somatic stress release, a process of restoring our biological adaptation system. Scott is also the founder of Amala, a wellness brand dedicated to creating sustainably sourced tools for transformation. Scott is a licensed clinical psychologist, doctor of osteopathy, and mind-body medicine practitioner who specializes in therapies for infants, youth, and adults. Scott is the author of the book Addicted to Drama, Healing Dependency on Crisis and Chaos in Yourself and Others. And with that, I will now hand it over to the two of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here with all of you. And it's always a pleasure to have any time with Scott and his team. It's really a delight and great to hang out with everyone that's joining today.
Just a reminder for those who are just coming in, Diane's having a little bit of Wi-Fi issues, but you'll be able to hear her, but the video might be a little off at times, but we get to still soak in her wisdom.
Thank you. Well, I guess we'll dive in. We have a limited amount of time, and I want to just share as much as I can in that time with you. We'll have a little bit of time for Q&A later on, so don't lose your questions, write them down. And also, we're looking at what some of the core relational wounds are, and I thought I would share through the lens of attachment theory and attachment experience, which I think is even more important today. So of course, with secure attachment, I feel like it's a little bit like winning the jackpot. If you grew up in a pro-social family, your family knew how to connect, they knew how to repair when things kind of went off the rails a little bit, which will always happen a little bit. And they knew how to make you feel mostly safe and protected. They had fun. They knew how to play. They had a sense of humor. They just were okay with alone time and okay with connection time. They were relaxed in a lot of this. They were able to regulate themselves and help you regulate as a little one. All these good things, right? And lots of good rituals around, when we separate, like mom or dad has to leave for whatever reason, or, eventually we go to kindergarten, or, we're leaving for work later on as adults. They had like good rituals about that. Like you stop what you're doing when somebody comes in the house and you give them a big, yummy regulating hug, and you stay in the hug until you feel each person's body regulate. Those are some things that really feed and nourish your secure attachment system. So there's a couple things we'll mention about that as we go along. I do want to highlight the fact that, and I think Scott and I are in the same camp on this one, that we are biologically designed for healthy attachment. You know when it's good and you know when it's not so great, right? Even though we normalize our histories, whatever happened to us. But biologically, all the way back to Bowlby, we talked about that it's inherently part of our experience to know what secure attachment is. And then, of course, we don't always get born into the ideal scenario. And we're going to talk about when things are, we adapt away from secure just to survive, whatever our circumstances are. But I like to think of it as like secure attachments in there. and it's underneath everything, and stuff gets piled on top of it, or gets wounded, or, we'd have to adjust to whatever happens in our lives as we're growing up. And then, of course, I feel that strongly impacts how we are in our relationships as adults. So I'll try to bridge a little bit between what happened in history, perhaps, and then what might show up as adults when we're hanging out with our beloveds, or we're dating, or even with our coworkers. So it predominantly comes up related to people you're more intimate with. You're as a little one, it would be your primary attachment figure. When you're older, it's usually somebody you've been in a relationship with that you're super connected to. And it sometimes takes about a year for it to show up, because sometimes as an adult, it takes about a year for your attachment system to recognize, oh, this person's in my life. This person's, going to be here. They're somewhat of a permanent fixture, or at least we're exploring a deeper relationship. And then sometimes, surprise, surprise, the honeymoon period gets interrupted with some old attachment injuries that might seep in from history. So I hope to demystify some of that today. But let's look at how we adapt away from secure. And we're trying to build a bridge back to secure all the time, even as we're trying to heal whatever, attachment injury we might have collected along the way. And we have to understand that moms and dads, and dads and dads, and moms, they have their own histories. They're human beings. They're a work in progress too. So sometimes they don't provide the perfect environment. I mean, they do their best usually, but often they have some wounds trailing from their history. So it's very easily passed down generationally, whatever disturbances might be there. So as I'm talking, you might recognize a mom or dad or a partner from the past, or a partner you're in a relationship with now, or yourself. What some of your reactions? So let's talk about avoidant attachment. That usually sets up in childhood if there was a lot of neglect. Maybe a parent has unresolved trauma. Maybe they're somewhat dissociated. They just don't have much of their social engagement system available because they're still dealing with something that was really difficult. I mean, the human journey is challenging for all of us. So then, but if you're a parent and the child is naturally going to reach out for connection and even cue for connection, babies aren't completely, just not in the game. They're doing a lot to try to make connection happen. They're gurgling, they're cooing, they're looking adorable. They're giving you these little smiles and gestures and eye gaze and all of that to try to encourage connection. But if nothing responds from the parent, usually because the parent has some injury themselves, it's not resolved, then the child doesn't have any other way to deal with that other than adapting back to themselves, because there's nobody out there that's consistent. There's no empathetic other. There's nobody they feel like they can be present with or can be present with them. And you have to understand, for all of us, I had some of that in I have a little bit of all of them. So I'm an equal opportunity attachment injury person, including a lot of healing towards secure, thank goodness. But I can relate to all of them personally. When there's a lot of neglect, and sometimes that happens, like in my case, my mother, I think, had some kind of postpartum thing when I was born, just a strong reaction. So she just wasn't very there, and so for whatever reason, when the other person isn't present, it can feel like neglect, or nobody's home, nobody's there. And that's terrifying to an infant. You need somebody there. You're very dependent when you're young. And so the way that can happen is a neglect. It can also be active rejection. It can be a parent that just is living in anger a lot, and they're just looking at you with, not kind eyes. They're looking at you with rejection or anger or hatred or something like that. So often we need to heal the attachment gaze related to avoidant attachment. Avoidant attachment is interesting because it can also set up when your parents are very left brain with you, and they just don't have much access to their own emotions, and they aren't then able to reflect your emotional states as a little one. So sometimes they're really good. They show up, they're super present when they're teaching you something left brain, like how to read, how to write, maybe how to ride a bike later on, how to build a sandcastle. It's all about building skills, and that's very left brain. So you might have some access left brain with them, which is great, but the right brain part just doesn't seem like it's getting in play so much. And that's really a key to developing healthy attachment, is right brain to right brain, emotional, attuned, presence, being able to be connected and stay present in your own body and embodied experience of connection. Stephen Porges would talk about social engagement, and we need safety for that. If you have a parent that's chronically angry or chronically scattered or chaotic, or that's going to impact how you feel like you can attach to them. And the thing is, it's so cool to think about this, and maybe also devastating depending on your history. We're like little sponges and we're babies. I mean, even in utero, I believe you're just absorbing actually even your mother's taste preferences and her emotional states. And then when you're born, you're just like a little sponge for not only how your parents are relating to you, but also how they're relating to each other. Whatever's happening in the relational field is impacting your original blueprint for what is relationship. Is relationship safe? Am I honored and respected? Is there attunement? All of that's getting encoded in your little baby body before you have mental capacities to make any story about it. So it's embodied in this implicit way. And that's why so often later, as adults, we have these knee-jerk reactions. We might even react like, or see like, well, why am I isolating? And my partner's trying to connect and all I want to do is run in my room and read a book. Why? And often we don't make the connections back to that was maybe the only way we knew how to survive was to isolate, to be more on our own. So avoidance tend to move towards a sort of a knee-jerk isolation because their early experiences weren't so juicy about connection. It was disappointing or hurtful or just nobody was there and it's a painful experience. So they tend to want to be self-sufficient. They tend to be actually super smart. Not that all the other attachment styles aren't, but because they're so left brain oriented to survive, they're often great teachers. Here I am. Now they're often, here's the guy, we're all trying to communicate, but they often don't have a feeling that connection is going to bring good things. So they don't know what to do with it. I mean, I had that happen when I was married. My husband would, be very loving, and I didn't know this, but he said, I'm saying I love you and I'm hugging you, and it just sort of washes off of you. And I said, at first, of course, I got mad. I said, I do not. Then in the middle of the night, I woke up and I'm like, oh my God, I do that. I don't know what to do with loving contact. I didn't have it as a kid. So it made me uncomfortable. Then I had to make a spiritual practice of, okay, I'm going to stay present every time somebody's nice to me or does anything kind. And I had to actually make it a practice. And then I could receive his love because, of course, it was painful to him that I wasn't taking it in. It was kind of just washing off me like Teflon. So you might recognize some of this in people or yourself even. So I made it a practice. It took maybe 6 months to a year for me to be able to just take in all the good stuff. Yay, yum, and not deflect it. So if we go to ambivalent attachment, that one sets up a little bit different. So an avoidant person will tend, for survival reasons, that gets wired into your brain on a survival level, that to survive, I have to be alone, or to survive, I have to meet my own needs. I can't really access a support system. To survive, I'm going to be very left brain and super productive. Usually avoidants put all their energy into get the job done, and they aren't distracted by the emotional relationships on the team. They're not distracted if somebody likes them or they like each other or there's a little disconnect. They just go off on their own, do their job and get it done. So that's useful in society, right? That's a gift, but it's also nice to have both. You can have effectiveness and connection. That's what secure attachment is. So we're trying to move people back into getting more comfortable with whatever disruption they had around connection being not so comfortable. In the ambivalent style, usually ambivalents had some good experiences with their parents. They had some yummy love connection. They got some of their needs met. But their parents were so inconsistent that it was a little bit like going to Las Vegas and working on the gambling machines. You're putting I guess I used to say quarters because I'm old, but it's $5 bills now, I imagine. But, they'd keep yanking the thing to try to get the apples to line up or whatever, to get the love in the relationship with their parents. But you just never knew what was going to happen. And that's called, psychological terms, intermittent reward. An intermittent reward is the experience of when you just don't know if you hope something good's going to happen, but you just have this anxiety about, yikes, what do I have? Do I have to twist myself into a pretzel to get the love? How do I get this person to be in their loving part of themselves? It can cause a lot of anxiety. So often there's an anxiousness about, will this relationship be stable? Will this person be here for me? Because usually in their history, their parent figure, their primary caregiver, whoever it was just maybe really yummy, but so inconsistent they just never knew when they were going to hit the jackpot, or when they were going to be incredibly disappointed. So sometimes if you have a lot of injury around ambivalent, we can be angry before anybody does anything wrong. We can be like anticipating that your partner, like in adult life, right, they're going to screw it up. You just know, because you know from history, it's implicitly encoded in your body. So you know, but you don't really know, because you're knowing from history. You're not knowing from what's happening with your partner in real time, but you project on them, okay, they're going to let me down. They're not going to show up. They're going to cancel at the last minute. And we're not going to go to the theater. You have this mental, inner dialogue going that's very disempowering to yourself and the relationship, and you believe it. That's the challenging part. So ambivalent folks tend to have a negative, they tend to actually be accurate about seeing relational cues. They read relationship like radar. They have radar for any nuance in a relationship. The tricky part is they tend to mistakenly interpret that information negatively, because they are just waiting for the disappointment, the letdown, or they're even will pick a fight with their partner because they're just sure they're going to screw up even before the partner does anything. Partner comes home with flowers and candy or whatever, and they're at the door mad at them because they're 5 minutes late for dinner, and they start a fight. I mean, it's just because it's wired into survival. This is the part I really want you to get. So you have compassion about this. Nobody's choosing to do this. Their survival, it felt like for them as little ones, when their relational blueprint was getting put together, that the only way they could get the attention and try to stabilize the attention from their parents, this loving contact, was to either be sick a lot or cry a lot. Their signal cry is on, because they believe, and they have the experience enough, that if they don't keep complaining or fussing as a little baby, it turns into complaining as an adult, that they'll lose their primary attachment person. So the job of all of us to heal is to uncouple this idea that connection has to be gained by complaining or being ill, or having an incredibly strong need to ignite the connection in the other person. And what ambivalents don't realize is they aren't so good with receiving. Their partner can be showering them with even good stuff. Not like all partners are perfect or anything, but they can be getting some really good juicy stuff in their relationship, but they tend to dismiss it, because if their complaining goes off, it triggers a survival thing. They get scared that they're never going to have connection. So it's a very interesting conundrum that they're wanting connection more than anything, and they're good at it when they get it, but they perceive that it's not there even when it's there. So they have to kind of practice receiving the caring behaviors. Actually, first, even noticing that their partners are doing caring behaviors. I've had ambivalents say, "Oh, they don't do anything. They're never around. They don't." And then I put them on kind of on the hot spot, and I say, "Well, wait a minute. You've been with this person for 2 or 3 years. There has to be something that they're doing that's yummy for you." And then when they pause, they usually a little mad at me when I make them do this, but when they pause, they start seeing all sorts of caring behaviors that they're not paying attention to. And what they need to feel is fulfillment and satisfaction in their bodies, their embodied experience about the relationship. And that's what they often can't do when they're still in this attachment wound, this core wound of feeling like, yeah, you're here for me today, but what about tomorrow? So it's always a yes, but even if you're like a therapist, your client can say that to you, "Oh yeah, you're here for me every Tuesday afternoon at 3:15 for our appointment, but what about you're going on vacation next week?" There's always a default to rejection or dissatisfaction. And when we recognize that, I have some of this myself. I told you I got them all. I have to really pay attention to the story I'm telling myself. Like I have a close friend, that I hang out with a lot, and I tend to always call. They don't call that much, and I start making this story up that, oh, they don't really care because I'm the one who calls. I mean, I can go on in this whole thing, and it's not true. This person's incredibly expressive about how much our relationship means to them. But, I have to watch those stories and not just automatically believe them. So this would be an exercise that could be helpful if you land in ambivalent a lot. And then I want to talk a little bit about the most complicated one called disorganized. And disorganized usually sets up historically with our families when there's been a lot of some kind of extreme chaos or maybe even extreme neglect, like way out there on the range, and also something scary. Like maybe you grew up in a household where a parent was addicted to something and their behavior got really strange, or they got really angry when they drank, or they, of course, this would include all types of abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, anything like that, where there's been a lot of threat. The attachment system wants to connect. But if that's inside the family, like with a parent or a sibling or something, it wants to connect, but then immediately there's a feeling like, danger, danger, danger. I need to either dissociate and freeze, or I need to, run away somehow. Like I would go to my extreme avoidant behavior of just checking out, leaving, or running away somehow. Or I would go into my fight response, right? You see this in films with the strange situation studies on YouTube, where the little kid will be running to their mom to hug them, and all of a sudden they hit their mother in the face, because internally they have the somatic confusion of like, I want to connect, but this person's dangerous, so I want to defend myself. So those are strong energies. I want you to think about the attachment system kind of like an instinct. I mean, think about, it's not a luxury item, like think about when you're hungry or thirsty, or, your threat response is an instinct, right? To keep you safe and alive. We need that, but we also need attachment on the same level. And here in a disorganized, you've got the pull, like the desire to connect really strong, trying to, so you can see it. And then the threat response coming in, blocking it or confusing it and making it disorganized. That's why it's called disorganized. There's a confusion emotionally, a confusion somatically, a confusion cognitively often. And when that gets triggered in us, sometimes we have residue of disorganized, or we have a situational situation, like we have pretty much secure attachment most of the time, but then maybe we had a parent that yelled when they were drinking, or there was, and then any loud noise will trigger us into fragmentation and dissociation. So that would be situational. If we grew up in an abusive household, day to day to day, or a lot happening over time, that might be called chronic disorganized. And of course that's more challenging, and we need to have our trauma informed skills and our attachment and sensitivity to move through that. But people can heal from all of these attachment disruptions. You can learn, or Dan Siegel says, earn secure attachment by doing, like even when I talked about my staying present when there was loving contact around me, I learned how to do that. I learned how to get through the discomfort of not knowing what it was, or feeling foreign, or feeling like, oh, it's going to be bad. I had to learn to take in the yummy stuff. It's worth doing, because now I have all this yummy stuff I can actually enjoy and feel, But the main thing I want to leave you with is that we have so many great healing stories about people moving from attachment injury back to secure attachment. I believe your body, mind, soul, all of you, is designed to heal and transform, and that when we can be with it in a way that we understand it compassionately for ourselves and for other people. What I love about understanding this idea, this research, this theory, is that it really, for me and so many of the people I work with, opens this compassion. Instead of like judging yourself for your certain behaviors, or judging your partner harshly for certain behaviors, when you understand that so much of this got encoded when we were little ones, when we were in our infant bodies, little kid bodies, that if we can heal that, then it changes pretty quickly often the behaviors that we go back to, or we just kind of get triggered implicitly as adults. And we can, as adults, have specific focuses that help us regulate ourselves and help us, realize what we need for safe space if we're disorganized, like who is a protector that we can import in our experience when we're feeling that chaos or that fear that comes up related to attachment. So there are specific corrective experiences, like when I'm teaching this in a longer class, that we have people go through, not only just cognitively, but experientially, so they can actually feel their shifts happen. So with that, I'll land for now, because I want to make sure we get a chance to hear from Scott, who's going to be talking to us about shame.
Yeah. So who here recognizes some attributes or characters of some of those attachment styles when they hear it from Diane? Yes, I've seen lots of waving a hand. And then when we kind of check in of like, we hear that, and what's kind of a natural response in our own body? Yeah, like, oh, I saw a lot of people do that, or kind of looking down. And Diane did this beautiful thing of really humanizing this process of attachment, of really identifying, hey, this is an instinct, this is a survival strategy. And while that is such a beautiful offering, sometimes we bypass, we don't even hear that because we're having such a strong response to it. And when we think about these core wounds, these like ways in which when we don't have this secure or consistent safety in relationship, it kind of fragments us. Yeah. And in that fragmentation, we start to ask the question, why? And instinctively, not necessarily cognitively, but often like, why aren't they showing up? Why were they loving one moment and not another? And especially before the age of 11, and even as we grow into these our young childhood life, and these patterns are consistent, we start to fill the fragmentation with beliefs, like, and often those beliefs are centered around us, what we did wrong. Yeah. And so filling in some of those wounds or fragmentations is actually these beliefs that we're not good enough, or that we're not deserving of their love, or if I was better, if I was a good boy, or if I was a good girl, or if I was good, then this wouldn't have happened. Yeah. And those belief systems are almost glued in by a process or an experience of shame. Yeah. And shame is so interesting because we wouldn't actually have shame unless we were biologically wired for it. And so there's something really important to understand about shame is that, again, we wouldn't have it unless we were biologically wired, meaning it has a purpose. And in understanding its purpose, we can understand when that purpose goes off and how we get stuck with the shame. So the purpose of shame is to create a momentary immobilization or a momentary pause. And in that pause, we often evaluate what's happening in ourselves, in our values, in our boundaries, and in the relationship. Yeah. And in an ideal situation, what happens in that pause is we learn, we understand more, we take in, and then we reconnect. And when I say reconnect, Diane mentioned the word rupture in the very beginning of what she was sharing. And that's a really important word in relation to shame. So all relationships, even great ones, especially great ones, have ruptures and repairs. It's actually how we deepen and reassure those attachment, especially secure attachment. Yeah. And so when we don't have, as Diane was talking about, those consistent relationships, or those safe relationships, or those emotionally vulnerable relationships, we don't have the opportunity for rupture and repair. Or as we, and the rupture is where we have that immobilization or that shame freeze. And in the repair is where that shame freeze thaws and we actually can grow closer to someone. Yeah, so I'll say that again. In a rupture, like, I'll give an example, and this is one I give a lot. Like, I'm playing with my niece in the yard, and I say to her, okay, I'm going to throw the ball, but if it goes past you, don't run into the street. And I throw the ball, and it goes past her, and she runs in the street, and I say, hey, stop, that's not okay. That's actually a rupture. It creates a little freeze or pause in her nervous system to evaluate what's going on. And then I walk over and I say, I'll grab the ball. And it's really important that you don't run into the street because I love you so much and I'm here to protect you. Yeah. And that's why I raised my voice. And I hear that it might have been scary in that moment. And I love you so much. And your safety is so important for both of us. So that's the rupture, the pause, and the repair. And in that moment, she gets to go evaluate the situation and go, oh, yeah, it's not safe to run into the street. That's what we call healthy shame, where it has an opportunity to pause and repair. And so that freeze and melts back into connection. Yeah. On the other hand, we have something called toxic shame. And in toxic shame, we have just the freeze and the rupture without the repair. So if I had gone to my niece and I said, hey, that's not okay. Why are you being so unmindful? Why aren't you being smart enough? You should know better. I'm like, go to your room. So we have this rupture and we never get this moment to repair. So she stays, her little nervous system stays in the freeze of the shame. Yeah. And that freeze weaves itself into a lot of those belief systems. I'm not good enough. Yeah. Or I have to really earn love, or I'm not smart enough, because what happens in the toxic shame is the person who's in the freeze believes they are the problem, as opposed to the problem is the problem. It becomes personalized. Yeah. And we become really stuck and frozen and really wrapped around those beliefs that we are the problem. And so that embeds itself within those core wounds that Diane was talking about, especially because we don't have the opportunity to repair deeply in relationship and thaw out that shame. And so that's part of the things that keep those attachments stances, those attachment styles frozen in our body, is the shame that accompanies it. Yeah. And so starting to recognize these moments of our own shame, even sometimes hearing the word shame can create a little freeze. And so just take a pause and notice if you're holding your breath or there's a part of your body that's kind of like a little stiff or frozen. And we're just gonna, or you might notice your eyes kind of heavy or your body slumped over, and just finding a little bit of micro movements. So letting your eyes sort of move across the space, seeing some colors or some shapes of things, maybe letting your ears track a couple different sounds in the space. Yeah, moving your shoulders, finding a little bit where there's some flow, a little bit of movement in your toes, shifting your weight. Yeah. So we're just finding our way out of some of the freeze in our body that accompanies the shame. Yeah. And that's actually going to allow us, every time we um, can start to unwind some of the shame patterns in our body, it's going to give us more access into those survival strategies that are often hidden underneath the freezing of shame. So dealing with shame is really important. Yeah. Sometimes it's the shame of like, oh, we developed this pattern, or it's the shame of that there's something inherently wrong with us because we never got to come back into relationship and repair, or our needs never got met. Yeah. So we'll talk about, for the next bit of time, kind of some more strategies of how do we start to address these core wounds that are really about fragmentation and a lot of shame and a lot of freezing in our whole body that maintains those survival strategies, even as we grow older and have maybe better relationships that are possible. And one of the strategies, whether it's more avoidant or anxious, is to start to come back into what are we feeling? What are we feeling in our body, especially when we are in relationships? Relationships are mirrors. Yeah. So they're going to reflect back what is actually present in us when we can take our attention away from the other person and bring it back to what's happening in me. Okay, they're being avoidant, they're narcissistic, they're da 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 da. Yeah. And the question is, how am I showing up in relationship? Yeah. Or if any of us are familiar with the idea of like we have a friend, in air quotes, we have a friend who's always like, I just keep dating this same person. They're this avoidant person, or they're this anxious person, or they have this a particular addiction, or they're obsessed with I just keep dating the bad person, the wrong person. And one of the hardest questions to ask ourselves, or one of the hardest things to recognize, is, well, what's the common denominator in all those relationships? Uh-oh, it's us. Okay. Well, if we start to focus on us, oftentimes the shame comes back. And it makes it harder to focus on us. So we often keep focusing on what the other person is doing or does. Yeah. It's amazing how we have these protective mechanisms, yeah, to avoid the pain of the shame, or to avoid the pain of the original wounding and fragmentation. And so we really hyper focus often on other people and what is happening in them, when really relationships are mirrors. And it's a gift, even when it's painful. It's a gift because it's so hard to often be in our focus of ourselves. Yeah. So when we think about a relationship, and it doesn't have to be a romantic relationship, it can be a friendship like Diane was saying, or a parental relationship, or a sibling relationship, or romantic partnership relationship. And one of the things I often invite us to do is to go, what are the common feelings? And I'm going to bring up the PowerPoint. What are some of the common feelings I have in a particular relationship, or multiple relationships? And so, just to help, I often bring up an emotions chart or emotions wheel for people. And I go, just kind of like, when you think about this relationship as a whole, what are some common emotions that get evoked or come up for you? And these are the larger categories, and then we can get into more specific words. Yeah, so you might even try this now as a practical exercise. It's like, think of one particular relationship, maybe one that has a little more spice to it for you, or tension. And then just kind of look at these words and see which ones resonate in your body. Notice if you also start to imagine or think about what they do, and come back to you and just kind of notice what emotions are present in you. Yeah, so I'm going to toggle between this first page and this second page. Just take a minute. Maybe you'll write them down, or just kind of note them for yourself. What emotions are familiar, common when I'm relating? Again, this isn't about the other person right now. This is about what feels familiar in you. I'm going to pause this. So we're looking at emotions, and then we might even ask ourselves, what's the sensation or imagery? So I might imagine that other person there for a moment. I might imagine my friend or my partner, and then I'm going to bring my focus back to me. What's the familiar or most familiar like sensations? Well, I feel this heat in my chest, or I feel coldness, or I feel delight or warmth. I feel expansion or contraction. What are some common sensations that you have? So shifting away from your focus on the relationship itself and more on what's happening in your body. Good. You might write those down or just again note it for yourself. And so what's helpful is to maybe do this with a few friends, this practice, or a few partners, ex included, or both parents, for example, and kind of start to notice again the common denominators, the common sensations, the common feelings. Yeah. Oh, I often feel disappointment, or I feel sad often. That's a familiar feeling. And the way that shows up in my body is kind of like this like slumpness and like the sense of like powerlessness, or like that someone's coming at me and I have no protection. So again, I'm just kind of noticing what feels familiar by using a relationship as a mirror back to myself. Then we can get into some juicy material. Yeah, so we're starting to just get familiar with what's familiar. And that's going to give us a lot of insight into what are some core missing needs in us. Yeah. So we might ask ourselves, okay, those feelings are and those sensations are familiar. Like I get really contracted and tight, and my sense of like my boundary gets really small. Um, or I feel angry, and my behavioral response often is to get critical, or start to notice what's the behavior that often comes out. Yeah. The behaviors, as Diane was saying, are often strategies to keep us further away from the underlying core wound and the pain there. Yeah, so when I get sad, as opposed to really hanging out with the sadness and seeing what's there, I get really reactive with people. And I tell them they can't meet my needs. Yeah. So we're starting to also recognize the familiar behaviors, because oftentimes those behaviors are things that we then focus on or someone else focuses on that keeps us further from making contact and healing the underlying pain. We are tricky as humans. We are very tricky in our survival strategies. And we have all of these ways of really not being in touch with the original or core wound, because some part of us believes that we are still in the place where we do not have enough time, support, or resources to actually heal and process and unfreeze. Which is also a belief system. It's almost like our memory from back then is still on a loop that says we don't have what we need to actually allow this to move and process and pass through. So that's a big thing that we also have to correct in the experience in the process of like, oh, I do have the time. I like have a therapist, or I do have enough resources. I have really beautiful friends that love me for who I am. Um, or I have space in my life to actually come back and process things now where I didn't have that then. So we've noticed what emotions are familiar, what sensations are familiar in relationships. We notice what behaviors are from us are familiar, the ways we kind of maybe take us further from our core wound and the emotions. And we might notice the outdated beliefs that we don't have what we need in order to be with the pain. All of that's going to be really helpful for us to finally break through and address the underlying pain. And we have a few other ways of getting a little bit deeper towards that core wound. Yeah, and so I'm going to bring back the PowerPoint, and it's beginning to understand the missing needs. Yeah. Because it's not just the impact of a neglectful parent or a really scary experience as a child. If we had relational support, if we had our core needs met, oftentimes those traumas, those pains would actually have been processed and moved through. Not always, but often. And so some of what we have to unravel and unpack to get to that core wound is what was missing. What was so fundamentally missing? And again, when we're so focused on other people's behaviors and what they did and who they are and how they've hurt us, is we don't recognize that a lot of our own feelings and a lot of our own behaviors are stemming from these early missing needs, that early child with the missing needs who's actually in the driver's seat of our life right now. Yeah. So we ask ourselves, okay, what in our life has really felt absent? And go ahead and ask yourself that question. What in my life has felt really absent? Okay, I feel like maybe I haven't had enough close friends, or I haven't had people who really come towards me and call me on my birthday, or call me, or hang out, invite me to events. Yeah. And then another question that kind of helps us get closer to that core wound is, what have we been searching and longing for? Yeah, such as like, I've been really searching for someone or something to tell me I'm good enough, or I've really been looking for that sense of validation that I belong. Yeah. And again, it can be helpful to identify, how have we been filling that void or substituting that need in our life? And on this page is more the needs, the seven most common needs that often are surrounded or connected to these early core wounds. Yeah. So safety and security, so protection, safety, rest. Rest is a big part of what we get as part of safety. And in order to really grow and develop and mature and expand and explore, we also need to rest. And we oftentimes don't get that, especially when we feel like we don't know when the next potential threat or challenge, or that, as Diane was talking about, that inconsistent love is. We don't get to rest because we're looking for it, or we blocked ourselves off because we might not get it. We don't actually get to go, okay, yeah. And that derives from enough safety and security. Is connection the thing that we've been longing for, that missing need that's really part of that core wound? Yeah, whether it's love or a sense of belonging or attachment, community, communication. Have we been searching for validation, like a reflection of who we are? People saying, yeah, that, like, I know for myself, like, I was constantly looking for people to validate my experiences. And I would say, does that make sense? Does that make sense to you? When I was sharing something, as opposed to like, yeah, that feels really true in me, and I'm validating myself. So my unmet need was so much about like validation and empathy, which really, especially when we didn't get that as kids, we might be constantly seeking it. And even when we're seeking it, as Diane was talking about before, we actually can't receive it. So it's almost like the need is on overdrive, but the ability to recognize that we're getting it, or the ability to absorb or receive it, is offline. And that makes it that much harder to have those corrective experiences that are part of healing that core wound. And then we have play. There's all this beautiful research and science right now coming on play that it reinstates our sense of curiosity and exploration. And oftentimes when we didn't get play, it's very we have this sense of stuckness, this inability to feel flexible and adjustable and adaptable in life, because that's where we learn it, is through play. And is our core need that's been unmet, that's part of that core wound: choice, agency, autonomy. If we have a parent or a caregiver who's like always up in our space and we didn't get enough breath, we start to feel enmeshed and we don't have that autonomy. I am here and you're here, and we can meet. That's what this beautiful thing in secure attachment is like, you're here and I'm here, and we find the meeting between us. And when we don't have that, we oftentimes don't experience a sense of choice in life, as adults even. Also is the sense of trust, which oftentimes comes with consistency. Like, I can rest in myself and know that I will be okay even if someone else isn't, or they can't show up. The fundamental sense that I have what I need, and that I can open up and lean into something that is consistent and available. So is trust something that feels like it's so hard to trust people? And as adults, that might show up as checking people's phones, or not believing them where they are, or having this lingering feeling of like, is everything okay? And then the other fundamental need that's often unmet as kids is emotional regulation. That ability to have that, I'm looking for someone. Often as adults, we're like, I'm looking for that person who can regulate me. I want to be rescued. I want someone who can save me. I want this. And that is a reflection of oftentimes what we didn't get as children, the person to hold us in their arms so that we can feel the safety, security, consistency to find our own ability to process through and regulate ourselves. And in turn, we often look for that from other adults and other relationships, unaware that actually we have to do that for the little kid who's in the driver's seat, and no one else can truly do that for us. So take a moment just to kind of recognize, what have been some of the unmet needs in your life that have kind of been in the driver's seat? And when you recognize that or identify that, you might just notice, how does that show up in your body? How does that feel? Or not feel? Yeah. You might even turn a little bit more inward and see, can you see that child that's maybe in you, who holds those unmet needs, who experience those unmet needs? Just kind of noticing what they look like, or sound like, or feel like, even in this moment. And knowing that you are not, as the adult, the same as that child. We want a little bit of space, enough to be able to see them and give them space to be felt. Like, oh, I see you. Maybe inviting them to get curious and see you as the adult as well. And in that space that you're creating is a relationship where those unmet needs can start to be addressed, and then the core wounds can also start to be healed. Yeah. Not that it's always just that simple. Just to be clear, that can take a significant amount of time to learn how to feel again, to be able to address the sensations of your body, to recognize the beliefs and the behaviors, to identify what these core unmet needs are and the way they've been showing up in your life. And certainly can take a fair amount of time to build a sense of trust and relationship with that little part of us that has been acting and responding and kind of frozen, often in shame, around that core wound. Yeah. So with that, we'll pop Diane back in, and then we'll take some of the questions in the Q&A box.
Scott, thank you so much. It was beautiful.
My pleasure. Thank you. Let's see. In the context of dating, when someone has an attachment wound, how can they differentiate the person they are dating has a red flag, or if there's an avoidance kicking in when they feel more and more connected to the person? So essentially, like, Dan, how does one differentiate, quote unquote, a red flag versus maybe their own propensities and processes?
So one of the things that can happen in dating is you can experiment with people's reactions that might indicate secure attachment or not. Like you can ask, early on in dating for a need to be met, something not like gigantic, like you want them to buy you a Mercedes, but, something that's doable. And if the person reacts negatively to any kind of expression of need, it might, you don't want to make assumptions on one incident. You got to kind of collect data over time, like Sherlock Holmes or something. You got to collect data over time. You don't want to jump to conclusions. But, just if it sort of happens over and over again, the person's sort of annoyed if you express any kind of need, it could even be as simple as changing what time you're getting together for dinner, then that could be an indicator that the person's a little bit more towards avoidant. They just feel like, okay, I take care of my needs, you should take care of your needs. And relationships are a lot about helping each other experience filling needs. I mean, we want to do our own work and we need to do our own, have our own self-efficacy, but also we're sharing things. We do have a need for connection. We do have a need for snuggle time. We do have a need for, play time. We do have a need for safety and protection. I mean, those are legitimate needs. And sometimes if someone's a little bit tilted towards avoidant, they will sort of dismiss a person's natural needs as not okay. And now, if you're tilted towards ambivalent, you might be having unrealistic expectations about someone always being available to regulate you because you don't know how to regulate yourself. So you have to make these distinctions. Okay, when I'm looking for regulation, totally fine. But, and maybe my partner's available for snuggles or hugs or talking or, going out to dinner or whatever. But if not, do I know how to self-soothe? Do I know how to access my support system outside the relationship? Do I know how to, think about to take a walk in nature with the dog and, fill myself up with nature? So those are the kinds of questions that are interesting to explore. So red flags, or if someone just continually doesn't show up, they make dates and they ghost you, that's a big red flag. I mean, there's some pretty major red flags that sometimes we don't see because we're sort of used to people not really respecting us or not honoring our boundaries or whatever that might be. And does someone intrude on your boundary? Like you say, you're working until 5, but they keep calling you while you're on Zoom or something. I mean, there's just different ways you can, but I think it's important to ask people, well, what does that mean? I sort of notice this happens a lot, or, you're changing our plan, like you're calling me up 15 minutes before we're supposed to get together and canceling, I mean, is something really urgent happening? And this seems like it's sort of a pattern. I just sort of, the story I'm telling myself is that I'm not that important, or if something else better comes along, you go that direction and you sort of let me go. I mean, we have to be careful of the stories we're telling ourselves, but also to check it out, check it out with the person.
Yeah. I think in our culture right now, there's a lot of labeling and a lot of like, here are the red flags. And we might, as Diane's saying, like, I think that there's clearly, if there are some things that, like, if you're saying, if some things are coming up, it is important to explore. Um, Clearly, if there's violence or abusive responses, like, that's really important to recognize and say, this is not safe, or this is not okay. It's not, it's an interesting question to ask ourselves when we're in a relationship of any sort. When was the last time I felt safe? And it doesn't always mean they're not safe. It might mean we haven't expressed our needs. We haven't expressed our emotions. There's a lot of nuances that are not as simple as they have this behavior or red flag. Because it's like, yeah, like Diane's saying, like, so someone keeps showing up late to a these dates, and you might say, I'm curious about what your process is around this. And they might say, oh, I'm really, like, I get really nervous about our dates and I keep changing my outfits. And meanwhile, you could be like, oh, this is a major red flag and you're always late and I don't think this is going to work. But meanwhile, they're like so nervous and sweet for you that we want to investigate and get curious, or like say, hey, no, it's not always possible to meet all my needs. And I just always want to give permission and reflection. Like, my expectation is not my needs won't always be met. But something that really means a lot to me is when people, when we're more clear on time. Because for me, I get more anxious, and I just want you to know that it's not that you are responsible for my anxiety, but that is my own relationship with time. And now we're having what's actually more of a relationship, because we're having this process and this dialogue that got uncovered. And it's like, this is actually going to bring us closer than just labeling someone with a red flag. Yeah.
I had a friend that about the time issue, she said that her partner was raised in a military family and everything had to be like, 100, or, everything had to be like,
Mhm.
and so he just had this rebellious reaction to it. So he was always like chronically 5-10 minutes late. And she thought she was being disrespected. When she understood that it was a reaction to this sort of very harsh military thing, she goes, okay, I can give him 10 minutes. It's not a big deal,
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes we don't even know we're doing it. Like, someone might say to me, it's like, I'm really like exactitude of time. And they might just say, hey, it's a lot for me. Can you be more flexible? Not, and maybe I'm like, oh yeah, thanks for bringing it up to my attention. I just didn't even know, because it's so my like normal.
Hmm.
But it's actually not something I care that much about. And I'm happy to just, if you see it, just give me a little heads up, and I'll keep working on it, because you mean so much more to me than whatever this is that I don't even have a lot of value around. Yeah. Um, Why is disgust the response that some people have in response to feeling emotionally intimate with other people? So oftentimes that's sort of avoidant, or do you want to start, or would you like me to?
Go ahead.
Well, what we can look at is what's called coupling reactions. So let's say in my family system, there was not a lot of clear and healthy boundaries. There was a lot of invasion, or I had a parent who I would parentify, that they weren't able to take care of themselves, and so they would just cry on my shoulder or talk about the other parent or family. And there's a way in which disgust, or like ick, is a natural response to being kind of invaded, to not have any space. And so we might start to go, oh, when I'm in relationship, because that's all I know as relationship, it couples with this feeling of ick, of like, this is overwhelming and claustrophobic. And so the moment we have relationship, we just go back into the coupling, the neurons that wire together fire together. It's like relationship, ick, closeness, ick. And it's not even like it, there's a part of us that doesn't even discern, this isn't my mom or this isn't my caregiver. It's just automatic and immediate.
That's when you know you're working with implicit memory. And the good thing about paying attention to it is it brings it up to explicit, and then you start to get some insight often, like those associations become clear, or it's available to be processed, with your therapist or with your friends or whatever. It's available to move through something that's related.
All right. So it seems clear on how to recognize the foundational wounds, what the foundational wounds are. It's not clear on actually how to heal that. So can we talk more about what is it that's actually healing, or what the process is that's healing? We'll probably spend the rest of the time on that, or clarifying what we've articulated. That's actually quite a bit of the work.
You talked a lot about that when you were talking, I thought, Scott, in terms of just the process of how to do that. I'm just thinking, if you think about the attachment styles, maybe there's a little bit I could say about that. If you're in an avoidance space, you notice that part of you is up, one of the expectations or beliefs or behaviors that Scott was alluding to earlier is that nobody's going to be there for me. Nobody knows how to meet my needs like I do. I'm better off doing it myself. And so one practice that could be, I'm just going to give you one little practice for each one, and there's many, so just know that, but would be to ask for things, to take a risk, because it's going to feel risky. I just met an artist. I was in an art in Santa Fe. I'm in Santa Fe right now. There's art like everywhere. It's so great. And I met an artist a year ago, and I really liked her. I really liked her work, and we kind of connected. And I invited her over for brunch. And this time I saw her just yesterday, and she goes, that was really hard for me to come to brunch because she's avoidant. She was taking a giant risk on her part. I thought I was just making brunch, I was being nice, but for her, it was a real struggle. And she said, this year, I realized I want connection. I want to hang out with you. I want to be together. I'm like, okay, cool. Because I've always been in that space, but I didn't realize that this was a really big risk she was taking to accept my brunch invitation. So one thing she did was get out of her comfort zone and allow herself to come to brunch and be uncomfortable. And I made her a nice brunch so that she at least got the reward of brunch. But then a year passed, and then she realized, oh, that was really good connection. I want that connection. And she was very forthcoming this year. I was like a different person. She was like a different person. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. Because I was unaware. I mean, I knew she wasn't the most social person, but I didn't realize I was actually pushing her out of her comfort zone in a really major way. But if I was the avoidant person like she was doing, she accepted the invitation, as uncomfortable it was. She reached out. We had a connection. And then she reached out this year, even much more clearly and much more strongly. And so I think accepting social situations could be a challenge, but do it and just see, okay, I can do this. I have a friend that they're in a relationship. They're good friends of mine. And he doesn't really like social things, but her work is really big on social. It's philanthropic. They do all these events, galas, and all this stuff. And their agreement is he can stay for about 30 minutes and go say hi to everybody that she wants him to meet. And then he's allowed to go into the car and watch movies on his phone the rest of the night. So, I mean, so he's going out of his comfort zone, and then he's doing what he likes to do, which is watch movies by himself in the car. I mean, you can work these things out, till the person gets more comfortable. So the other thing an avoidant can do is like ask for a need to be met. I mean, maybe you start out with, you're at the grocery store and you say, hey, how do you know which is a good cantaloupe? I mean, it could be anything, but you start to ask and you start to see if you can stay present when somebody actually meets your need, because that's going to feel like foreign. That's going to feel weird. For the ambivalent, it would be checking. One thing you could practice would be really paying attention to your inner dialogue when you're sort of dismissing other people's caring behaviors, or, you're not even seeing them, you're not noticing that they went out of their way to buy you this incredibly special birthday present that, they really knew you because they knew you would be the one that would like this. And you kind of dismiss it, well, but they didn't wrap it. I mean, it's like, I mean, it's funny when you start paying attention to your inner dialogue. It's like, geez, I'm really giving this person a hard time. There's no way they can win, because we tend to have this negative projection. So you could practice giving people the benefit of the doubt and also learning self-soothing, because we tend to think, okay, you, the other person in my life, are supposed to regulate me. Sometimes that'll happen, and that's very nice, but it isn't somebody else's responsibility fundamentally. We need to learn. I think we need both co-regulation and self-regulation. So for the disorganized, I mean, there's so many more things I could say about this. But for disorganized, like really looking at what situations or what circumstances help you feel a sense of physiological safety, because that's been so challenging. Some people just don't even say what makes you feel safe, and they look at you blankly like, what? What is safety? You're trying to help that become more embodied. That might be in the beginning being in nature. Nature for me is really good that way. Or being with your dog, because your dog's really reliably protective and kind of helps you feel safe because somebody intrudes on your space. However it comes to you, but eventually, and I mean, for me, I used to be like holding tree branches when I was hiking. I was feeling like connection to the trees. That was where I started, because my human connections were really not the best. So, but if somebody's starting with rocks and trees, you want it gradually for that to move to animals and humans, ideally, because of the progression. Um, so looking for safety, looking for people that actually do have a competent protective capacity. And sometimes in your life in the beginning, that's looking in the movies. Like who was really I mean, if a really strong example would be Mel Gibson in that movie, Braveheart. I mean, he was a warrior protector. And I have a friend that was abused as a kid, and she just loves that movie. That movie was hard for me to watch. I had to watch it out of order and in little pieces. It was so strong. But for her, watching Mel Gibson, just be a warlord was just what she needed as a competent protector. So somebody else, it might be the guy in Extraordinary People. I'm using these old movies, probably don't remember, but that was a pretty good therapist to the son, but he was a pretty lousy therapist to the mother. He didn't understand the mother's trauma or grief, and she was played by that famous person. Dick Van Dyke, the one that played the wife. Anyway, Mary Tyler Moore. But nobody got her. Nobody got that she was in this terrible wound of grief. I mean, she was acting like a terrible, not good person, but also nobody got her trauma. But the therapist for the kid was a good example. So you might find certain TV shows. I think actually media can be a good primer for secure attachment. If you watch the right things, like This Is Us or Parenthood, not the movie, the actual TV series, Brooklyn, the movie, Lion, the movie. It primes your attachment system to go in a positive direction. So I want to be mindful of time. There's something you wanted to.
No, I think that's beautiful. And in terms of the material I covered, it's those practices of connecting with the inner child, giving that child the unmet needs is actually a big part of healing that core wound. Yeah. Taking the steps in towards that. Yeah. Beautiful. Thanks, Diane. Such a treat to hang out with you.
I know we're having a good time, and I'm so glad everybody's here with us.